Hi, I'm Tom Doyle, and this is the plurality of quests in Lord of the Rings and elsewhere here at Epic QuestCon. I'm going to start right off by introducing our panelists, or having them introduce themselves, actually. Anthony, to you.
Hi, I'm Anthony Leoy. I'm a professor of English at the Juilliard School in New York City, and I write about environmental literature and American culture. And my book Nerd Ecology has a chapter on Tolkien and the Legendarium, and I have to say that has allowed me to say Legendarium almost as much as I've always wanted to.
Awesome.
Awesome. I'm James Eng. I teach mythology and Latin at a small university in Northwest Ohio, medium-sized university. Let's see. I write fiction. Most of my, but not all of my fiction is concerned a guy named Morlock Ambrosius. My first novel was nominated for the World Fantasy Award. And when I say it was nominated for the World Fantasy Award, obviously it didn't win, or I would have said that. I'm still writing. Tales from the Magician's Skull is where a lot of my stuff is appearing these days, although I've got a story slated for fantasy and science fiction around the middle of next year.
I'm Sarah Avery. I write contemporary and epic fantasy. My first book, Tales from Rugosa Coven, which is a collection of epistemological comedies set in New Jersey on the Jersey Shore with modern Wiccans. It, to my astonishment, won the Mythopoeic Fantasy Award, which is the Mythopoeic Society is devoted to perpetuating the legacy of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. So when they picked a book about Wiccans on the Jersey Shore and said, "Spirit of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, go for it," I was not expecting that. And then my book immediately went out of print because small presses have a life cycle that is short. But I have a Kickstarter novella that's out, The Imlin Brat, which is a lot of fun. And I've got a new short story coming out in Beneath Ceaseless Skies at some point soon.
And as I said, I'm Tom Doyle. I'm the writer of the American Craftsman trilogy from Tor Books. And I also have a book forthcoming called Border Crosser, which is I'll call it a twisted space opera, a psychological space opera, and that will be out October 1st. And like James, I have a story that recently appeared in Tales from the Magician's Skull. So we are, I think we're TOC mates in that. And
we're sword brothers.
Yes. Sword and sorcery growth. And so, so with the topic of this, we, as you may have seen if you've looked online for this, the Lord of the Rings is often viewed through the lens of a single epic quest, the quest to destroy the ring. But that kind of, paves over a lot of other quests that are going on, secondary quests. And so I thought we would talk about secondary quests, both in Lord of the Rings and elsewhere, and how they mesh with the main quest or how they don't in some instances, and a few other topics as well. I thought for the first question, I would like to hear, what is your favorite secondary quest? Not Frodo destroying the ring, but some other secondary request, either in Lord of the Rings or the broader Legendarium, to use that fun word again. So please, let me know, what are your faves?
Well, my new favorite as of just the past 36 hours is Tuor's quest in The Fall of Gondolin, which is kind of out there. Because it is a quest that it feels like the time for that quest is now or very soon. You know how stories sometimes find their moment. Tuor is sent to warn the Lord of the last refuge of elves in Beleriand. This is before the Lord of the Rings, and to tell them that if they don't come out and fight Morgoth now, that there will be no saving anybody in Beleriand, and Beleriand will be destroyed, which ultimately it is. And the elves in Gondolin decide that they're going to trust to their works, and which they love. They're not going to leave their city because they're so proud of it, and they are sure that it's going to be just fine, despite the fact that every other city and settlement of the elves in Beleriand has been destroyed by Morgoth. This feels very much like the moment we're in. and so Tuor, who is a human man, arrives, and he doesn't give up on the people of Gondolin. He's adopted into the royal household. He marries the king's daughter. But the whole time, he is fully expecting that this place he's coming to love is going to be destroyed, and that all of Beleriand will be destroyed, and that by not fighting the king about this, he's complicit in the loss of everything he's loving. And indeed, that comes to pass. And out of all of the tens of thousands of people who live in Gondolin, about 800 are saved because he leads them out. And it's a story of utter disaster, but his heroism is unmistakable. And I've got my copy right here. This was the last of the books that Christopher Tolkien edited of his father's unfinished things. In the earliest version of this story, the one that was written in 1916, when Tolkien was hanging out in an army hospital recovering from World War I stuff, we have this huge, detailed set-piece battle, city square by city square, as Tuor and his close friends get defeated block by Morgoth's army. And everybody's doing great, except that they keep losing. They're up against such overwhelming odds that they are doomed at every single confrontation. But he's written it in such a way that their heroism is still impressive. And if he had it's his first draft, but if he had invested as much in those characters as he invests in the characters in Lord of the Rings, it would be absolutely gripping. So I think that as we are entering an age of global warming in which we're going to see an immense number of disasters, and we have been warned, but we have not done enough. The kind of victory through the process of defeat that happens in this story is going to become the kind of victory that our descendants can look up to.
So if you're done, Sarah, to
absolutely.
James?
Sorry to take so long.
No. Just making sure you are finished. James, what's your favorite?
Well, mine is kind of hidden in plain sight. It's the quest of Aragorn to marry Arwen. It of course is a big deal, and the marriage takes place. He keeps them from going home so that he can have all his friends at his wedding. He doesn't seem to be a guy who has like a million friends, so that's why he wants the fellowship there. And it's a big deal, and it's a change. There are all these comparisons between Galadriel and Arwen. You remember Faramir and I think and Gimli have this argument about who's the prettiest, to put it in a vulgar way. But that's the secret engine on which the entire plot hinges, because in the appendices, there's a story of Arwen and Aragorn, and Elrond says, "Look, dude, my daughter is not going to marry some nameless ranger. I don't care who your ancestors are. If you were king of Middle Earth, of both north and south of Gondor, maybe that guy could marry my daughter, but otherwise, no." So you could argue that the whole thing is a reenacting of the Beren and Luthien story, which is Tolkien's story, the Tolkien story, him and his sweetheart, how they were forbidden to meet by Tolkien's guardian until they were both adults. And Tolkien is a good as a good Catholic boy, obeyed. But he and his sweetheart kept faith with each other and ended up together in the end. That personal echo just resounds over and over again through. In a way, he's only got that one love story to tell, but he tells it well. And it like I said, there's a lot of weight there. So that's one of my favorites. The other favorite is one that never happened. Apparently, Gimli and Legolas were supposed to go up north. In at least in Tolkien's early ideas about Lord of the Rings, and there would be some kind of shenanigans going up there with the forces of Mordor in Mirkwood and the Lonely Mountain, and I badly wanted to read that story, but it was not to be, I guess. And you can see how it's too far. That limb is too far away from the body of the story. But anyway, those two are my favorite.
Anthony.
So my first reaction to this question was obviously the answer is Éowyn's quest to reclaim her place as a shield maiden of Rohan. And I challenged myself, to say, because that has been the answer all along for me. And I know for many other readers and viewers, but I sort of asked myself, like, what is it that makes that definitive, right, as the answer for me? And I realized that, of course, first of all, it's a major eucatastrophe, right? Her disguise, right, which leads her into battle successfully, then ends up, as everybody knows, right, with the defeat of the Lord of the Nazgul, which is a eucatastrophe in and of itself. It's a surprising, happy turn in the story, right? Eucatastrophe was Tolkien's word for that, that fills you with joy, right? And I know so many people who were so filled with joy that they named their children Éowyn. Like, I went to college with a bunch of Éowyns. So it really left a mark in a good way. But upon reflection, I also thought that the reason that it impresses me so much is that it's a quest that sort of redounds to other people's benefits all around her in various ways, right? So Merry gets taken into the eucatastrophe, right, and he helps to defeat the Lord of the Nazgul, thus proving that a hobbit and a woman can do something that a human man can't do, according to prophecy, right? But then it keeps going, right? So that when Faramir proposes to her, right, he recognizes that she's the key, right, to making sure that Ithilien recovers from what Mordor has done to it, right? So it just kind of goes on and on. Like, there are these echoes and echoes of the quest that she achieves in really surprising ways.
No, that is an awesome one. I think rather than give my favorite, I'm going to add a couple elements to stuff you've already said. Sarah, I believe there's a portion of, is it the Unfinished Tales, where they expand on the tour, where Tolkien's expansion to like full Lord of the Rings length of the early part of the tour story of his journey to Gondolin. And it's a very strange vision quest. And yes, you can see that if he had gotten into the level of detail that he uses there, how invested, much more invested you might be than the kind of summation that you get in the Silmarillion. It was, and it's very different. It's very visionary. As far as people looking for religious allegories, they might have more luck in that extended tour section.
Yeah, Tuor is chosen by the god of the sea, because Tuor is a longtime friend of Turgon, who's the king who builds Gondolin. And so he'd sent Turgon to build Gondolin, saying, there's going to come a time when Morgoth will have destroyed every other fortress, and you're going to have to make the last place where elves can find refuge and where they can launch an attack from. And he builds the refuge, but they never launch the attack because they become enamored of their peace and their place. But then the blessed messianic child who comes along and gets the gods in Valinor to change their minds and come and help out and get Morgoth removed from Middle Earth, is Tuor's child.
Yeah.
So and as James was noting, the love story that we see again and again is one in which a mortal man and an immortal woman fall in love, and the woman chooses the man over eternal life, which Tolkien's beloved Edith was a good Church of England girl, and he was a good Catholic boy, and they had this strong feeling while they were courting that that if one of them converted to join the other's church, that could be giving up their hope of eternal life for love, and neither wanted to be the reason the other one missed out on heaven. And you can see in every one of these love stories that it torments Tolkien to think that he might have done that to the person who's most important to him. It's kind of weird. Where were we?
Yeah. Oh, well,
I've lost the thread. I'm sorry.
I just want to finish up a couple of comments here. The other is on James's note about the Legolas Gimli thing up
I
in
want that road
the
trip
north.
movie.
Well, you can see it in the appendix materials that he had a whole thing mapped out about the war in the north, and you can see how they would have slid right into that narrative if his notes were clearly written for it, because he had all that stuff in the appendices. Anthony, I agree with that's of course
Eowyn
one of my favorite. Eowyn is awesome. But going back to Eowyn and Aragorn and quests, and Sarah, we'll start with you on this one, because we had a bit of a discussion beforehand about this issue.
Refresh my memory.
The idea that, at least in Tolkien, the secondary quests have a common theme of renunciation.
Yes, absolutely. In the Silmarillion, the common theme is failure. Almost all quests fail.
Which is out of World War I, but go on. Yes.
And in The Lord of the Rings, the way that you can go on a quest for whatever it is. Say for Galadriel, her quest from when she was a young girl growing up in Valinor was to have a realm of her own that she would rule. And she accomplishes that goal. She apprentices under the greatest queen in Beleriand, and then when Beleriand is destroyed by the sea, she goes into what's left of Middle-earth and makes the most beautiful place there and rules it with the greatest wisdom of anybody who's running any place. But then she's offered one of the elven rings of power, and she knows that if she takes it, she will be, all shall love her and despair. We get the all shall love me and despair speech. And so for her, ultimately success is diminishing going to the west and remaining Galadriel. The initial object of her quest, which is power, loses out to the quest of being her best self. And that's the real victory that we have to root for, as much as we love Lothlorien and would have loved to see her rule it always.
James, Anthony, do you have a thought about the issue of renunciation in secondary quests, either in the ones you mentioned or in others?
Well, just about failure. Tolkien, being steeped in Old English poetry, it's all about death and doom. There aren't too many happy. There aren't too, the most optimistic one I can remember is the one that has the refrain, "That passed, so may this." And it's almost always, the world will end. You can build massive works like this old ruin, the work of giants, but doom will come. In life, we're just like a sparrow going through a lit drinking hall. We're there for a moment and then we're gone. So this idea of the pervasiveness of death, destruction, failure, how all works come to that in the end. That you have to learn how to renounce. because, you know, if you don't go willingly, you'll go unwillingly.
I think that the renunciation that moves me the most, maybe it's renunciations plural because Tolkien is all about trauma as well as failure, right? The renunciations that the character doesn't know that they're making at the time, right? But the one that comes immediately to mind is Frodo's renunciation, effective renunciation of the Shire. Right, like he is so wounded at the end, right, that he tries to go back home and then he realizes he can't live there, and so in effect he saved Middle Earth and the Shire for other people, but not for himself, right? And he finally does, of course, realize that, but it takes a long time, right? So those kinds of renunciations are really poignant to me.
But then he gets what almost nobody else gets. He gets to go physically to Valinor, which is not. That's not present in the pages of The Lord of the Rings, but
Right.
for Tolkien, it's present that that he gets to go in the body to the heaven that is denied to all humans. Because when humans die, when Tolkien's humans die, they go beyond the edge of the world, and nobody, not even the Valar, knows what happens to their spirits.
Yep.
So he gets the best.
No, he definitely doesn't just get a booby prize.
Yeah.
Right. But at the same time, it's like, you know, I mean, given the emphasis on how the hobbits are all such homebodies, right? It's really poignant that he loves the Shire but can't stay.
It's implicit in there's this paradox of Christianity itself, where you're a human being, you grieve the loss of your dead, but you hope they've gone to a better world, but that doesn't mean the loss isn't real. So the power of that paradox is very alive in Tolkien's work. The fact that there is hope, but that doesn't erase the loss or change the loss.
With the secondary quest you talked about, James, with Aragorn, that's a renunciation that kind of it's actually amped up even more in the movie. It's right there implicit in the text of the book, but it seems really visually clear that Aragorn goes on a suicide mission. And his whole quest to marry Arwen, to become the new, King of Men or whatever, he's not going to know all this timing is going to work out just so that he actually survives this thing. He's going there pretty sure that he is going to be snatched up, and that's all there is.
Can we talk more about eucatastrophe? Because I think that that's a really important part of the quests in Lord of the Rings, and we don't get eucatastrophe in the Silmarillion or the other great tales. No. And Anthony, I think you've thought more and written more about eucatastrophe than I have, so maybe you're the person to go with this.
Well, I completely agree with you that Tolkien, so in his essay of fairy stories, right, Tolkien is basically theorizing the Lord of the Rings, right? Like you read that essay and you're like, oh, okay, so he had a theory about what he was doing, and this essay is the theory and Lord of the Rings is the practice. But I agree with you. It is really striking that you can't get the joyful turn, right, for several ages, right? It just goes, there's, like you said in the beginning, right, there's failure, catastrophe, Numenor falls into the sea, and then after all of that, you finally get the possibility of eucatastrophe. And I've always been fascinated by this problem that Tolkien loved the idea of the joyful turn, right? But he himself was really what's technically called a declensionist, right? Like he thinks that it is the fate of human societies to decline, right? Ooh, look, watch them decline. There they go again, declining and destroying themselves. And so in many ways, he's working against his own personal instincts, right, when he includes these eucatastrophes. And I think that the reason is that he believes that enchantment and fairy stories, that's what fairy stories give us that we don't already have. Right? That human societies naturally decline, but that fairy stories give us the joyful turn that makes us burst into tears, right? He says that in one of the letters. And so I think, and not to go on too long, but just to raise the question of the fact that he tried to create a sequel to Lord of the Rings, and then what he realized was that he didn't want to complete it because there were no, like, everybody has receded except the humans, and if you just have humans, all you have is decline, right?
Interesting.
Yeah. So he gets like 30 pages into it. And Christopher Tolkien published this fragment too. I forget what it's called, but he gets 30 pages into it and he's like, oh, I guess I just have this gothic thriller about how people are now going to be murdered in the dark. Right.
Mhm.
And so, because it's only humans, right? Like the elves are gone. The dwarves have receded right into the depths of the earth. And so that's it, right? So eucatastrophe is like one of the ways he plays against his own instincts.
I wonder if it's also part of how he figured out where the stories were going, that the two stories he tells, the two books, if we think of LOTR as one book, in which we have a happy ending and the joyful turn, are the ones he wrote for publication. And the ones he wrote for himself are just endless doom.
He did try to publish the Silmarillion. But what was the beautiful phrase he used? On advice of others, he decided to. Apparently, Rainer Ulwin didn't like the Silmarillion, so he went back to writing the New Hobbit. But yeah, in terms of catastrophe, it occurred to me that as we were talking, the one love story that doesn't follow that renounced immortality pattern is the story of Turin Turambar, which is the most tragic, I think, of all Tolkien stories, where the two people who fall in love and marry end up being brother and sister, and that their happiness rests on not knowing as long as possible. And that reminded me very much of the abnormal pairings, I guess, not to sound judgmental, but I think most people would count incest as out of bounds.
The characters do.
In Volsunga Saga, where what's his face? I'll never forget what's his name. Sigurd and Signy need someone to avenge their father, but none of Signy's children are strong enough. She has this horrible way of testing them, but none of them are strong enough to carry out the vengeance. So she seduces her brother without him knowing. So they'll have that double strain of Volsung toughness. And Sinfiotli, the hero who's born from that union, is the guy who helps his father/brother achieve vengeance. There's none of the horror of incest that Tolkien clearly feels, but Signy's career is one long string of breaches of human norms, and that's definitely one of them. So I think that's one way his Icelandic forebears influenced the way he told the story, and I think some Greek too, because there's something very classical about the way that the end of Turin's story plays out.
What I love about Turin's story is that so for those who are not familiar, Turin is part of a family curse. His father Hurin was captured by Morgoth and defied Morgoth to his face, and so Morgoth imprisons him in a high place where he can see, as Morgoth puts it, "You will see with my eyes, you will hear with my ears," which means through everything and across all distances. And you're going to see what I do to your family. Everything they undertake will be part of their doom. And so Turin is incredibly talented. He's athletic. He's incredibly charismatic. He's mighty in battle. The ladies fall for him left and right. He's a completely awesome guy. And if he hadn't been cursed, he would have been doing terrible damage to Morgoth and all Morgoth's works. But instead, precisely because of every excellence he has, he leaves a trail of destruction of everyone he loves everyone that the virtuous people of elves and men in Middle Earth relies on for their safety. And my favorite bit of the more recently published stuff from Christopher Tolkien's last three of the Great Tales volumes is he imagined some moment when Turin and Tuor, who are first cousins but have never met, Tuor and his traveling companion, they're headed for Gondolin, and they're sneaking through the woods. Nobody knows where they are, and they hear a scream coming toward them. Someone is screaming in misery, running toward them, and they see this guy in black armor with a black sword, and he's wailing the name of a woman he's trying to find. And it's Turin, who is fleeing Nargothrond, which is the city that he caused the downfall of after he had been a guest friend there, and had been given a position of trust. So the king's daughter falls in love with him, as king's daughters are wont to do with Tolkien heroes. And then she's kidnapped by orcs and led off to be a slave in Angband. And so he still doesn't love her, but he's trying to save her. And so he's the scream coming in. He's continuing to scream. He goes on, I imagine, with the Doppler effect, like a siren. Ah! And I having grown up on Monty Python, I cannot avoid the Python-esque effect of this story. And so Tuor and his buddy just watch Turin coming, and they watch Turin going, and they're like, huh, that was odd. And they just keep going on their quest, which is doomed but has a eucatastrophe at the end, and that they're finally able to bring about the fall of Morgoth in the next generation. But every single person Turin touches is destroyed by him. And there are a couple of places where some secondary character begins to become attached to him because of the many ways in which he's awesome. And then they lose that connection. And the narrator says, and his doom never shadowed hers again, and so she was saved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You want to swipe past him on Tinder, definitely.
Yeah. Swipe the other way.
Right. James, quick thing. You have a seminar you teach on sagas and the Silmarillion. Is this a sort of thing you cover with the Volsung saga and Turin and stuff like that? Or what sort of connections do you put into that?
It sort of grew out of the Norse myth class I teach. There were a bunch of students who wanted to read more. And they were also, every third sentence out of my mouth in my Norse myth class involved Tolkien somehow. So, I mean, they wanted to read some Tolkien along with some more sagas. So I picked kind of a weird set, which we hadn't read before. The story of Haedric and Hervor, which was edited by a guy named Tolkien. Not J.R. Tolkien, but Christopher Tolkien. It's one of it's a great work of scholarship put up by the Viking Saga for Northern Research, and I'm delighted that he devoted himself to the editing of his father's works, because he has to go down as the greatest literary executor in history. I mean, no one could have been better suited, more careful, more judicious as a reader and a writer. But God, what great editions we lost of Icelandic sagas that he would have produced. But anyway, so we read his translation and commentary on the story of Hervar and Haedric, which involves a magic sword, a black sword, which sometimes glows. It's pretty clear that was an influence on the senior Tolkien. And the name is Turfing.
Yeah.
So on the theory that you steal from the best, my hero Morlock also has a sword called Turfing. It means the grip of Tyr. And my character's adopted father is a guy named Tyr, so it makes sense plot-wise. But I also want to have a glowy sword in my sword and sorcery novel. So we read something called the Saga of Gunnlaug Wormtongue, or Serpent Tongue. And you might think he's the bad guy because of Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings, but he's actually kind of the hero. He's just got a nasty mouth, which constantly gets him in trouble. So, I mean, there's this other poet.
You should teach that one in New Jersey.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, he's always putting the bite on somebody, and then they become his lifelong enemy, and they end up killing each other. But that saga is a love story, a doomed love story. Which, like I say, Tolkien had his own love story that looked like it was going to be doomed. But I think that was kind of an influence on him too.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
it's not like he's saying, "Oh, I'm gonna steal these 5 pages and put them in my stuff." But you can tell that he's soaked in this stuff, and that he's constantly going back to it and being refreshed by it. Although he claimed that he never reread a book. What does he say? Nothing can restore the bloom of a first reading. So he was not a big rereader. Which, given how often people reread Lord of the Rings, people will brag about the number of times they've read the Lord of the Rings. I wonder if he was just trying to tweak those people a little bit, because that's in one of his letters, I think, from the 60s or something. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to suggest, Anthony, I know you have some interests outside of Tolkien that we were discussing beforehand. And one of them, I'd like to hear your take on how secondary quests are handled in at least the TV version of The Magicians.
Sure. Before I take up The Magicians, I just wanted to respond to James and say that it's worth noting that I think the most famous rereader of Tolkien who is still alive and talking about it is Junot Diaz, right? Who says that he rereads Lord of the Rings at least once every year, right? So it would be worth talking about, like, the place of rereading in the Lord of the Rings if we have time. But anyway, to The Magicians. So in the TV version of The Magicians, which is based on 3 books by Lev Grossman, which are considerably different, right? The TV show starts out sort of repeating book 1, and then there are a lot of divergences. The interesting thing about quests that I noticed upon rewatching, right, is that the first quest for almost everybody is the quest for magic itself, right? So it's a quest to go from a secularized world, right, a disenchanted world where nothing makes any sense and doesn't mean anything, into a world of meaning and adventure and love and suffering and renunciation and all of the things we've been talking about. So The Magicians on TV, right, is also really interesting because, unlike the books, which really focus on one traditional protagonist, the characters immediately, the other characters, that they are still main characters, but not the boy, right? Not the guy that the story is really about, Quentin Coldwater. They immediately start asking questions about, like, well, how did we get here? And why does he get to be the center? And when do we get our quests? And who's giving these quests anyway, right? And what does it mean to go on a quest? And the entire series, right, because now it's concluded, unfortunately, all 5 seasons constantly ask that question about the politics of who gets the quest, right? And if it's possible, if you are not one of the chosen ones, right, what do, right? Can you get a quest through your own effort, right? Isn't there structural injustice, right, in giving certain quests to certain kinds of people and not others, right? So that's like an endless, we could talk about this all day, right? It's a deep primary concern of the story itself.
I wonder if that kind of rippling outward of viewpoint isn't almost inevitable when you adapt a book or any written source to a visual medium, because our friend and colleague Kristen Abbey and I used to have conversations about interiority and the novel, because interiority is the one thing that the novel does better than any other art form. It can take you to a character's inner life and have you dwell there as intimately as the author wants, whether you want to go there or not. And film can't do that. The closest film can get is voiceover narration, which usually turns out to be an abomination, right? I mean, watch Blade Runner with the voiceover narration and without it, and see which one is the superior storytelling. So when you adapt a story that has one central viewpoint character and you strip away the interiority that it being prose fiction allows, the camera doesn't care who is the central character. And the whole phenomenon of an awesomely adapted character performed by an awesome performer stealing the show, it's very hard to avoid, even if you want to keep one central character. And sometimes it's better just to let it go and see where the story takes you. Some of the
Agreed.
best stuff I think that that Game of Thrones did was allowing that to happen, where I mean, although you have chapters in the Song of Ice and Fire in which you get the title character for that chapter, that's the title of the chapter, we never waver from that character's viewpoint for that chapter, and the next chapter it's somebody else. But you get ensemble scenes in which we can glimpse through the actor into the interiority of multiple characters at once in a way that reading the novels can't give us in the seasons that really worked.
Yeah, the Magicians is a rethinking of it's like Narnia for grown-ups, right? So
Exactly.
the book begins with a reconsideration of some of these tropes. I guess I never watched the show, so I can't address that. But yeah, one of the reasons the book was interesting, and one of the reasons why people hated it, was because it took some of that Narnia stuff and said, "What is this about?" You know, and because they're adults, you know, they do drugs and have sex and stuff, which Edmund and Lucy almost never did. But it's for me, it was like almost a stereo effect. It's like watching a video with a commentary on. I was like getting a sophisticated commentary on the story that was being told me. So anyway, I thought it was awesome.
I only made it through.
He's got a new novel out, by the way, The Silver Arrow, for young adults.
Oh, nice.
I haven't read it yet.
I only made it through the first 2 seasons of the show, and then it felt as if the writers of the show were being so... It became suffering porn, in my experience. Other viewers, I'm sure, had different experiences. Some people went on and watched the series, but it felt as if the writers were tormenting the characters not to raise the stakes, but to say, look how much we can make these people hurt. And there's enough suffering that I couldn't take on more.
So Sarah, I just wanted to say, so here's like our secret. Sarah and I went to graduate school together.
Oh,
shocking!
Okay,
you are
right? No, but this is to the point that I think
10
that
years
the
in the
reason.
trenches.
Yeah, right. Well, I think it's at like 10 years in seasons 1 and 2, right? Because what really happens, my theory of what happens in The Magicians is that when the TV series allows the characters to leave graduate school, that's when the pathological aspects of the suffering for its own sake actually stop.
That
right?
makes perfect sense. Oh, audience,
found
do
that to
not
be
go
true.
to grad school. Do not undertake a different quest. You will not find meaning by getting an advanced degree.
Sarah, you brought up Game of Thrones, and it was occurring to me thinking about this, that on the one hand, the quest, we have this convention, Epic Quest. It's a big part in the design of role-playing games of all sorts, live action, tabletop, whatever, quest elements. Still a big part in Sword and Sorcery. But as far as being a part of the big fantasy narratives, is it still there as powerfully?
Well, I mean, if your definition of quest is the character sets out with a goal, goes through lots of tribulations to accomplish the goal, accomplishes the goal, and comes home changed, the character who has the most obvious quest narrative is Daenerys Targaryen. And that, of course, is twisted in some very interesting ways. Other characters leave home, have adventures, and return home changed too. But but their quests, if you want to call them that, begin reactively rather than proactively. It's not just that there's, Daenerys does not have exactly a call to adventure. She's been trapped in a narrative that's trying to force her to claim queenship since she was a toddler. But other characters are forced out of what would otherwise be very straightforward lives of administration and dynastic marriage. And, they would be bureaucracies with mergers conducted by means of sex. That's what your arranged marriage is. But then they're forced to have other kinds of lives that include actual adventure. I don't know I was reading up about Campbell's idea of what a quest is. And he has 17 steps in his, 17 discrete parts in what makes up a quest narrative. He wasn't expecting every quest story to have every part. But it's still a little bit crazy making just to look at it and think, like, okay, it took you 30 years to come up with that because you couldn't get there without that. And how is that really useful for explaining stories? Let me come back at some point to mentors. Mentor figures in quests, I've got a lot of thoughts about. But.
I sort of kind of think that Campbell is overrated. This idea of the monomyth, it's right there in the name. It's a little too monotonous. Yeah. And I find him as a reader of stories to be humorless. And when you're reading someone like Ovid, who always is writing with his tongue in his cheek, you don't get those stories if you don't get that there's a joke. And sometimes, this is terrible to say about a scholar, but sometimes I found him, I think it's in The Flight of the Wild Goose, he's writing a lot about the Arthurian mythos. And I kind of find him to be often inaccurate. He'll claim things support his position. And then you look him up and you say, well, wait a second, maybe not. He's leaving out a step in the argument saying, this is why this piece of evidence supports my position. So I think he's in love with the pattern that he sees, which is very dangerous for a scholar of stories. I love Tolkien's on fairy stories because he understands the soupiness of story and how stories can contaminate each other and affect each other without being necessarily the same story. I guess I trust Tolkien much more on stories than I trust Campbell.
Me too.
And if you need a pattern to shape a hero according to, I've always liked Baron Raglan's The Scale and the Hero, which again is a list of bullet points, which the hero might have or might not have. But is certainly, it's indicative, the bullet points are indicative of the kind of detail that usually becomes part of a hero's story. So anyway, it's much less constrictive, I think, but each to their own.
Anthony, any thoughts on this?
On Campbell or
on general, this whether the kind of quest narrative still has as much domination in our era of long fantasy series or big doorstopper books? Is it still the same sort of spine of the story as much?
Well, to build on what everyone else has said so far, I do think that something that's changed is that the quest is still present as a structuring element, but oftentimes it's a collective quest, right? There's been an emphasis on what you might call group quest or community quest. And I think that that's very much modeled on Lord of the Rings. I think that's one of the contributions that LOTR made, right? That it made it possible for the story to be about a group trying to do something that maybe some of them don't even understand as a thing, right? But they're all still doing it together, right? And that's one of the solutions for the magical boy problem.
So one thing we were kind of kicking around a little bit before, and I'm interested to hear your views on it, is there's this idea that the land is a character in a fantasy novel, particularly in Tolkien, particularly Middle-earth. If it's a character, it can't really travel on a quest, but does it have a quest? Is it acting out an agenda through the characters, against the characters, with the characters? How is the land involved in this?
If you look at the legendarium on the largest scale, the land changes. Maybe one of you knows offhand. I think that Tolkien was doing plate tectonics before plate tectonics was accepted science, because the wars between the Valar and Morgoth, before the elves or the humans who were created by the larger god above them ever woke up, are vast. They're tearing up continents. They're drying up inland seas. They do all kinds of crazy things. There's no sun and moon for the first several thousand years. I don't even know how they reckon them as years. There are mountains on which the great lamps are put, and those illuminate the entirety of our flat Earth 24/7. There is no night. And then when Morgoth destroys the lamps, there is no day. And what replaces the lamps is a couple of glowing trees, which is awesome, except the couple of glowing trees are off in Valinor, and nobody outside Valinor can see them. And so, like, there are no elves or humans yet, but the entirety of Middle-earth is lit only by the stars. And then when Morgoth kills the trees, the last bits of light that can be salvaged from the trees get put into the sun and the moon, and a couple of Maiar demigods get appointed to carry them across the sky. And it takes a really surprisingly long time for the Valar to decide that they want the sun to rise in the east instead in the west. So when the humans first wake up, like, the sun is still going back and forth, and the moon, sun, and they're still crossing on a daily basis. It's crazy. So the idea of what the cosmos is really different, and the land itself is not stable. And what we know about the end of the last battle, supposedly when Morgoth sneaks back into the world and the last battle comes, is that that the entire Earth will be destroyed and remade after Turin Turambar returns from the dead and kills Morgoth himself, which I'm sure was going to be really gratifying.
Imagine the CGI in the film version.
Yeah, right. Actually, speaking of imagining the CGI, I would like to go at this question first by saying that in the Jackson films, right, it's quite clear that Jackson thinks of certain features of Middle-earth as characters with agency because the way they're filmed, right, and sometimes the special effects that you spend millions of dollars to make really concentrate on the appearance that the land is doing the action. So for instance, when the action starts with humans and hobbits, right, like when the signal beacons are lit, right, yes, to call Rohan to Gondor, the way Jackson films it, right, you don't see people lighting the beacons on each of the mountaintops. It's just that the mountaintops, right, just burst into flame, right? So it really does look like the mountains themselves are doing it. And I think that this is consistent with Tolkien's idea. So I'm going to throw this half-baked idea out and see what you all think of it, because I've only just started to think about it this way. There are definitely, there are obviously locations in Middle-earth that have agency of certain kinds, because when you enter their boundaries, certain things happen to you, and you become something, right, that you wouldn't have become before. So like Gimli's transformation in Lothlorien, right, and so on. Like, we could just go on and on. But the basic point, this is the half-baked part, is that I think that the way Tolkien represents the agency of many of these lands, right, is through a figure of an embodied genius of place, right? So that Tom Bombadil and of course Galadriel, right, and Elrond and Rivendell, and even the hobbits together in the Shire, right, are like these embodied geniuses, right, who are the incarnations of their place, right? And so that it's actually really hard on that level to separate what the place is doing from what the people are doing. But I don't know. I mean, like that's a half-formed idea. What do you think of that?
Well, there's Fangorn, right? He's
Yeah.
he's a person and a place. I think it's really persuasive. When you were talking about the place that changes you when you go into it, I was thinking about the Old Forest. And when you named Tom Bombadil, it was like ding.
Yep.
So I think that's very persuasive. This might be a thing that English people think a lot about. How Englishness is part of being. It comes from the land itself. I don't know if you guys read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but in that book, magic derives from the land of England itself, and not apparently other lands, which struck me as odd. There's something to that. I think this idea of the land growing sort of through the people and changing the people that live there.
That's something that I don't see in fantasy set in America, as distinct from American fantasy, things that are written here, except in Tom's books. that Tom has in his American Craftsman novels. There are spirits of place and there are places of spirit, and they embody and enact all of the contradictions that are part of Americanness for good and for ill. And it's fascinating and delightful.
Thank you.
Everybody should track down, at the very least, the first book and give it a chance. See if it's your kind of thing. I loved those books.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. But I'm going to retaliate with a pop quiz, and then we're going to have one last really quick question, because I don't know if this is a half-baked question. If we can have a half-baked theory, which was actually a good theory and didn't seem fully baked.
Okay.
Well, just a quick thought, and then we'll go into kind of final statements and wrap-ups. And and I, by the way, highly recommend reading Tales of Rugosa Coven, but I've more recently commented on the Imlin Brat as being a nice answer to the nihilism of a Game of Thrones sort of narrative. It shows what lengths people will go to not to kill each other,
Yes.
which is kind of fascinating. So the quick sort of half-baked question. So we have this new TV series coming out from Amazon, $1 billion. Is it going to be quest-oriented, do you think? Or it's supposedly set in the Second Age. Will it be quest-oriented or more saga?
Second Age. Oh,
Yeah,
goodness.
will it be more saga-like?
I have been deliberately not following news of that because I want I want to be surprised and I don't want to be annoyed, because there were things that I heard about the LOTR films before they came out that really irked me, that Jackson and company ended up thinking better of. So I walked into the theater for the first film expecting to be irked about certain things that then never appeared on screen. So I can only speculate. The Second Age is such a weird choice.
Yes. It has more to do with copyright, I think, than the movie rights than anything else. But
And the obsession, modern obsession with prequels. Give me the next chapter. Don't give me something that happened before the first chapter. I guess I've committed that sin myself, but I feel like we look backwards too much. But of course, a lot of the magic goes out of the world at the end of the Third Age, as Anthony pointed out. So maybe there's some reason for it. But in terms of things that annoy me, I guess that's something that annoys me. It might be like a Monster of the Week thing, or a Quest of the Week. But nowadays, there's less and less tendency in TV writing towards that, and there's almost always some long-term serial storytelling strategy, or they are pretending there is.
Well, in the Second Age, you could have King of Numenor of the Week, because there were a whole passel of them.
Sure.
I mean, I kind of hope, what I'm hoping for it is that they mix saga with quest, right? But I'm absolutely, like, to just echo what everyone else has already said, I'm terrified that it's just going to be prequel, right? In the bad sense.
Oh well, they haven't contacted me, so.
I mean, we'll see. We have to give it a chance.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take, why don't we do final statements in the same order, one last thought, and also tell where people can, where people can find your work or find you online and, websites, that sort of thing, and start with Anthony and go down the panel, the photo panels here again.
Okay. Half-baked final thoughts to follow the theme. Well, I think that one of the things that impressed me about the secondary quests in Lord of the Rings, when I started to think about them again, is the sheer profusion of them. Right, there are so many of them, and they really succeed in being quests of different kinds. Not all of which succeed, as we've all said. But I mean, in my own training, right, the when you say quest, right, I immediately go back to Quest for the Holy Grail. And the crazy thing about the Grail literature, especially the
Still
matter
the greatest
of
fantasy movie
France.
ever made.
Sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry. I said it's still the greatest fantasy movie ever made.
I mean, like many bows, right, to Holy Grail. But the Grail quest in its original form is really a little boring, right? Like it's a little tedious, and once the poets get a hold of it, then it gets exciting in different ways, and you sort of switch up the protagonists, and they have different strengths. But when you start searching for the Holy Grail, and that's what you're looking for, and in advance that only one person is going to achieve it, right? It's a little stultifying. So the thing that I appreciate in retrospect about all of the different quests in LOTR is that there are just so many of them, and they're so interesting, right? And the characters are really different from each other. So that in that sense, right, if I can dare to say this, in many ways it improves on the source material.
Oh, and your final any place?
My pitch for myself.
Yeah.
So my book Nerd Ecology is still being printed. Oh, thanks, Sarah. See, this is what friends are for, right? They bring your book when you forget to bring your book. It can be purchased online at your preferred online bookseller.
Excellent. James?
I'm going to second the idea that the literary version of the Holy Grail story is rather tedious. And in particular, I'm angry how the French writers treated one of my favorite Arthurian characters, Gawain. And when there's more, it's a principle of online writing advice that's all terrible. Except there's a piece of advice I've seen circulating, and I forget who it's attributed to. Every character in a story should want something. Whether it's even if it's just a glass of water. So I mean, in a fantasy setting, those could take the form of quests, but it's a way to motivate your characters. And they don't realize they're in a novel unless it's that kind of metafictional thing. They just think they're living their life, and people do not live their life thinking that they're secondary characters in the quest of the chosen one. So it gives more reality and texture to the storytelling. If different people have different concerns and pursue them, even at the expense of what a reader or the writer might think of as the main point of the story. If I'm not sure whether that thought is fully or only partially baked, but anyway, that's my thought. You can reach me if you want to on Facebook. I realize it's problematic, but I'm still there as James.Enge, E-N-G-E. And I'm on Twitter too as James Enge, all one word, J-A-M-E-S-E-N-G-E. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. Anyway.
Okay. As a teacher, I think a lot about mentor figures. And when I'm writing, I often find that without intending to, or even if I'm actively trying to avoid doing so, I have mentor-mentee relationships that are central to the book or story that I'm working on. And so looking at the mentor, who's an important figure in the way Campbell talks about quests and some of the other theorists of quest literature, I looked back at Tolkien for mentors. And in The Hobbit and LOTR, our mentor figure is Gandalf. Yay! Gandalf is one of the wizards who got sent from Valinor, I think at the end of the Second Age. Does it sound right? He's
into the Third Age a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
So he's not even in Middle Earth during any of the stuff that happens in the Silmarillion. He comes way after that. And if he had been available to the people in Beleriand, they might not have been destroyed beneath the sea, because he's a great mentor, right? Do you know who does most of the mentoring in the First Age? Morgoth. Morgoth does all of his...
Worst dissertation director ever.
Yes. So he does all the stuff to trash the earth before the elves and men are created. And the Valar arrest him and they lock him up in prison for like 1,000 years. And eventually they let him out on good behavior. And so he sows dissension among the elves who come to the West. And he drives Fëanor to great feats of creativity, but one of them is creating the Silmarils, which drives all of the tragedy, all of the failure, all of the disaster, genocidal wars, and goodness knows what all else in the Silmarillion. You know who the mentor figure is in the Second Age? It's Sauron. So Sauron disguises himself as some other guy. He disguises himself as an elf, I think, Anatar, and he's the mentor of the elf who creates the 3 elven rings. And so he's like, I have all this great smithcraft that I want to share with everybody. And so he's making all of the rings that he gives away to create his Nazgul. And then when he's arrested, he gets dragged back to Numenor, where he manages to persuade the last king of Numenor that he gives awesome advice. And so he completely destroys Numenorian civilization and drives them to irk the Valar so much that they cause the entire island to sink beneath the sea. So pick your dissertation director carefully. Be careful whose advice you follow. Mentors are really important.
Yeah. And where can we find you, Sarah?
Best place to find me is on Twitter at Sarah Avery Books, all one word. The Inland Brat, you can find any place you would order books online. You can order it through the bookstore of your choice if you want to help out a bookstore getting through these difficult times. Tales from Rugosa Coven, I actually have, my graphic artist friend gave me a copy of the cover. Wasn't this a beautiful cover for this wonderful out-of-print book? It is out of print. If you absolutely must get it, and you cannot wait until I find it a new home, feel free to buy a paper copy off of any used book site. Please don't go to the online pirates. The electronic book pirates, they completely destroy the ability to get an out-of-print book back into print. So I would love for you to go forth and buy a copy that gives me not one single penny in royalties. Just don't give it to the pirates. I laughed every day while I wrote Tales from Rugosa Coven. It is a fun, fun book.
Good stuff. My wife's from New Jersey, so the words from that one really rang in my ears. I could hear her voice.
Oh, thank you.
So that's I think we're just about out of time. So I will say my own goodbye. I'm again Tom Doyle. You can find me at tomdoyleauthor.com is the website. I'm the Tom Doyle who writes science fiction and fantasy. I'm not the one who writes on kind of religion in the Middle East or about musicians' bios. So if you search Tom Doyle science fiction fantasy, more likely to find me. I do have the Tom.Doyle on Facebook name. I got on that early, so I'm there on Facebook. I am TMDOYLE2 as my Twitter handle if you want to see me there. And again, Border Crossers, my Twisted. There is a quest element to it, but it is an awfully twisted quest in this space opera, psychological space opera. Is out October 1st and should be available through all the usual channels online, and I'll be posting about that on these places, and that should be coming soon. I have the copy edits now, so it'll be coming out very shortly.
Congratulations and thank you.
Well, and thank you all for doing the panel. Thanks to Epic QuestCon and Peter for putting this together and doing all the technical stuff. Appreciate it greatly. You've been a marvelous panel. I hope everyone enjoys listening to you, and have a great weekend.
Yep. Stay well, everybody.
Thanks. See ya.
Thanks.